Okay, let's go through and analyze the welfare effects of the government instituting a production quota. By welfare effects, we mean what happens to consumer and producer surplus, who is affected by how much, and how much deadweight loss is created. By production quota, we mean instead of allowing the equilibrium quantity to be produced by the market, for some reason the government has decided that we want the market to produce less. So they pass a law saying we can't produce that amount. So let's go ahead and figure out the equilibrium quantity and everything that happens there, and then we'll analyze the quota. So our equations for the day are the demand curve is going to be P equals 20 minus Q, and the supply curve P equals 2 plus 2Q. 20 minus Q, y-intercept is 20, and the slope is minus 1. So we're going down to an x-intercept of 20. Down 1 over 1, down 1 over 1. And for our supply curve today, 2 plus 2Q. So the slope is 2. The y-intercept is also 2. So we're going over 1, up 2, over 1, up 2. And there we go. Now, as always, let's label everything. So this is the supply curve, but it also tells us the marginal cost of producing each additional unit. Over here, the demand curve also tells us the marginal benefit. How much would people be willing to pay, or what's the most people would be willing to pay for each additional unit that they might purchase. And we see here the equilibrium looks like it's a price of $14 and a quantity of 6 units. So let's calculate the total revenue and the consumer surplus and everything else we might be interested in. So total revenue, price times quantity, represented by this green rectangle here. So 6 times 14, $84. Now the next thing I ask here is calculate and label the total benefit to the consumer. Total benefit is the total area underneath the demand curve over to the equilibrium quantity. And what we're trying to do here is add up the most people are willing to pay for the first, the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth, and the sixth unit. But the way we're going to do that is find the area underneath the demand curve over to 6. So let me just highlight that area so that we can visualize it. So everything in this yellow highlighted box here is what we call total benefit. And it's going to tell us the most people would be willing to pay in order to obtain all 6 of these units. So what we want to do is just take that total revenue. We're doing geometric math here. Take the total revenue, the green rectangle, and add to it the missing part, this triangle on top. You might notice that that triangle is going to be consumer surplus. So we can go ahead and calculate the consumer surplus, add it to total revenue, and that'll give us the total benefit. So that consumer surplus is going to be 1/2 times the base, 6, times the height, which is 6. So 1/2 times 6 times 6, $18. And so the total benefit is total revenue plus the consumer surplus in this case. So that would be $102. So to sum up what all this means is if this consumer is going to buy 6 units at the equilibrium price, they're going to pay $84 for this. The most they would have been willing to pay to get 6 units would be $102. The difference, $18. That's consumer surplus. Just the difference between what they were willing to pay and what they had to pay. Now the variable costs is the area under the supply curve. So again, what we're trying to do here is just add up the marginal cost, the additional cost of producing the first, the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth unit. Instead of actually doing addition, it's actually more correct and easier to do an area here. So this area is a trapezoid, and we want to divide this trapezoid into 2 parts. We have a rectangle on the bottom here, plus this triangle on the top. And so the rectangle on the bottom is 2 times 6, so that's 12. And then we want to add to that this triangle, which is 1/2 times 6 times 12, from 2 up to 14. So 1/2 times 6 times 12 is going to be 36. So 36 plus 12 will give us our variable costs of $48 total. This variable cost tells us the total amount spent in things like labor and materials, anything you use more of when you produce more units. So to produce all 6 units, these businesses would have to spend $48 in labor and materials costs. Now, producer surplus is this triangle right here. It's the area above the supply curve but below the market price. And so that triangle is 1/2 times 6 is this leg of the triangle, and 12 is the other leg. Looks like it's going to be the same as this triangle right here, 36, right? 1/2 times 6 times 12, $36 in producer surplus. And that producer surplus means the total revenue that they take in, the entire green triangle, minus their variable costs. So it's how much a producer has left over after they pay their variable costs, but before they've paid their fixed costs, things like rent. Now, total surplus is just the producer surplus plus the consumer surplus. Graphically, we're looking at this triangle plus this pink triangle. Let me highlight the entire thing in pink. Sometimes it's easier if we just think about that total surplus as being one large triangle. You can get it 2 ways. You can add the consumer surplus plus the producer surplus, or you could just calculate the area of this large triangle. 1/2 times, and I like to think about this along the y-axis as being the base. I kind of flip it on its side in my mind, times the height, which is 6. So 1/2 times 18 times 6 should give us the same calculation as if we just added $18 plus $36. The total surplus here, $54. So $54 consumer surplus plus producer surplus are the gains from trade that are made because this buyer and this seller can exchange in this market. So I always have my students practice writing sentences explaining what all these numbers mean. Because if we don't, it's just a geometry class, right? So again, total revenue, how much money the buyer pays to the seller. The seller puts this money in the cash register. The seller is going to pay their variable costs down here of 48. They're going to have this amount in producer surplus left over after they pay their variable costs. It's not the same thing as profit because they still have to pay some other costs called fixed costs. The consumer surplus up here is just the difference between the total benefit, which is the most they would have been willing to pay for 6 units, and how much they had to pay. And now let's get into the point of this video. What happens if we have a production quota? So suppose we could not get to the equilibrium quantity of 6 units because the government passed a law saying, nope, you're not allowed to produce 6 units. You can only produce 4. So this production quota of 4 units, what would that do to the market? So let me just highlight that total surplus that we have if we are able to get to equilibrium as this yellow triangle here. And then it makes it really easy to see what happens if you have a production quota. So let me drop a line down here. I think about this quota as a wall. The government says we're not allowed to go past this wall. So if we're not actually able to produce anything after the 4th unit, this might be a little bit easier to think about if we think about these quantities here in thousands. So we're not able to produce the 4,001st, the 4,010th, the 4,500th, the 5,000th, or anything up to the 6,000th unit here. That means that we're not going to be able to generate this consumer or producer surplus here on the right side. So if all you're looking to do is calculate the deadweight loss, then the deadweight loss is just going to be this surplus over here on the right hand side that we are not able to generate. Why not? Remember, consumer surplus is the difference between the most they were willing to pay and what they had to pay to get, well, however many units they're getting. Here the consumer is only getting 4 units. They're not able to buy the 5th or the 6th or the 5,000th or 6,000th. And so you can't get this extra benefit, extra enjoyment that you got, that you were willing to pay, but you didn't have to pay for if you're not able to get those goods. Similarly, the business will not be able to generate revenue over and above the marginal cost if they aren't able to sell the 5th of the 6 units. So now the total surplus, instead of being the large yellow triangle, is going to be this smaller shape here. So there are a couple of ways we could calculate this deadweight loss. The easiest way, most direct way, is just to calculate the area of this black triangle right here. So that triangle, again, I like to turn it on its side. All right, so here I've copied this and I've rotated it to the left, so then we can see 1/2 base times height. So from this point to this point would be the base. So we can just count over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then the height is going to be 1, 2. The difference between the 4 units and the 6 units that we're able to buy. So 1/2 times 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times 2 is going to be $6 in deadweight loss here. The deadweight loss is just the difference in the total surplus that we get now compared to the total surplus that we got before this government regulation was imposed on us. Now for many classes, this is going as far as you need to go. What I personally like to do is take this a little bit further. I like to see exactly what the impacts are going to be on consumers and producers. And here's how you would do that. What happens when the government restricts the amount of something that people are able to produce below the market equilibrium quantity is the price is going to go up. This law is making this good artificially more scarce, and when something is artificially or in reality more scarce, the price is going to go up. So instead of the price being $14, what we usually see is that this price is going to go up to the highest price consumers would be willing to pay to get the 4 units that are allowed to be produced now. So we see that that marginal benefit, or the most people would be willing to pay for the 4th unit, is going to be $16. So the impact of this quota, in addition to having that deadweight loss of $6, that the market price will go up to $16 from $14. If the market price is $16 now for only 4 units, then we can see the new total revenue would be 4 times 16, price times quantity. So total revenue would be $64. Now, if consumers are paying a higher price, then their consumer surplus is going to be smaller, right? So that consumer surplus is only going to be this smaller triangle. Consumer surplus is always above the price consumers are paying and below the demand curve. Now, if we think about this variable cost, since they're not producing 6 units anymore, they're only producing 4, then our variable cost is going to be, as usual, the area underneath the supply curve, but now only over to 4 units. And as usual, we'd want to break that into 2 parts. We've got this little rectangle on the bottom, triangle on top. So that bottom would be 8, 2 times 4. The top would be 1/2 times 4 times 8. 1/2 times 4 times 8, 16. So now the variable costs would be $24. That consumer surplus is only going to be 1/2 times 4 times 4, so $8. This producer surplus now, producer surplus is always below the market price and above the supply curve. So we've got this big green trapezoid here. And as with trapezoids, we want to divide this into 2 parts, a rectangle and a triangle. So this line is at $10, it looks like. So we have this triangle below that goes from 2 up to 10. So 1/2 times 8 times 4. $16 is this triangular part. And then the rectangular part will be 4 times 6. $24 for this part of producer surplus. So the total would be 40. Now this brings us to the second way to tell how big deadweight loss is. What is the total surplus now? 40 for producers, 8 for consumers. Total surplus is 48. When we compare that $48 in total surplus, or gains from trade in the market, we see that that's lower than it was before. How much was it before? 54. So $54 is what we could get without this law. $48 is how much we're getting now with this law. That's a loss of surplus of $6. That's the definition of deadweight loss, the loss of surplus due to something getting in the way of the market working efficiently. If you go this far and you calculate all this out, you also get to see some more insights. For example, would producers be happier or would producers be sad at this law? And how about consumers? Would they be happy or sad about this production quota? Well, consumers, their surplus, their consumer surplus is going down. It's only $8 now. It used to be $18. So consumers are losing $10 of surplus. How about producers? Well, they used to get $36 in surplus, and now they're getting $40. So producers would be better off because of this quota, and consumers would be worse off. The deadweight loss comes in because consumers are $10 worse off. So if we just do the little calculus here of seeing who is how much better or worse off, consumers lost $10 in surplus, and producers gained $4, a net loss of $6 of surplus. So economists are not going to be judgmental if consumers are worse off and producers are better off. We're judgmental about the fact that consumers are losing so much more than producers are gaining, causing this deadweight loss. It's the total surplus that economists keep our eye on. Why don't we care about producers gaining at the expense of consumers as long as there's no deadweight loss? Producers are human beings, and so are consumers. And so we try not to take sides. We're doing positive analysis here. What is happening? The big judgment that economists would have is we are against deadweight loss. Creating inefficiency in the market, it's kind of hard to make an argument for that. So if you have any questions, please let me know. Otherwise, good luck in your economic studies, everybody. Bye-bye.